I think we're beginning. Okay. Kim Wickens grew up in Dallas, Texas, and practiced as a criminal defense lawyer in New Mexico for 20 years, and then she subsequently turned her attention to writing and studied at Kenyon College and has devoted the last several years to researching this book. She's a horsewoman herself who lives now in Lexington, Kentucky, and trains in dressage with her own 3 horses. I'm Miki Pfeffer. I'm going to moderate. She's the star. I'm the polisher. So we'll just make this, comfortable. So Kim, why this horse and why now?
Why this horse? And the why now question is very interesting as well. But this horse, I'm a fanatic when it comes to horse racing and race horses. And so my favorite horse has always been, before Lexington, Man of War. And I was reading a book about Man of War, and the authors compared Man of War to this horse I had never heard of named Lexington. And they said Man of War was to the 20th century what Lexington was to the 19th century. And I was intrigued, since I had never heard about Lexington, and started looking into Lexington, and there had been no book at all written about this horse, who they said was a legendary horse that had enthralled 19th century America, and that he raced prior to the Civil War and was a horse very much that unified a nation that was already tearing apart. And how could this be that you have this horse that was such a legendary symbol like that, and a symbol of hope to the people, and there had been no book written about this horse? And so I'm a lawyer. I started researching the horse to find out what I could find out about him. And it really just snowballed into a passion, really. I mean, just continuing to research the horse and going to all of these various states and historical societies, looking at archives. Of course, the Keeneland Racecourse Library was a huge repository of information. And I just, in a crazy idea, decided to write the story. It's crazy. But it took many years. So this story has been in my life for 10 years. And it wasn't 10 years of solid work because I was practicing as an attorney. But the story has been in my life 10 years, and it took about 10 years with everything to get it here today to you. And so that's why now.
Good. Well, in your epilogue, you say that on October 28th, which is today, 11 years ago, you were reading Man of War,
yes,
and discovered this horse. So I think that
is fascinating.
Celebratory.
It is celebratory. I was at a Denver Broncos game. I was in Denver for a Denver Broncos game and reading the Man of War book in the hotel.
I love it. So where did you begin your research then?
Well, so officially, when I started researching, of course I started, where does everyone look to find information immediately? Wikipedia, and there was nothing. I mean, it was, I'm not kidding you, half a page on Wikipedia about this horse. And I saw that there were some articles, magazine articles written about the horse, and so I did an interlibrary loan. I was living in New Mexico at the time. An interlibrary loan to gather these articles, and then it became very clear to me that to really find out, you had to go to the source, which is Keeneland Library. And so it was at the Keeneland Library where I really was able to dig through the 19th century sporting periodicals like the Spirit of the Times, the Turf, Field and Farm, the Thoroughbred Record, which was then called the Kentucky Livestock Record. And it was so, I enjoyed it. Miki and I were talking about this last night. And by the way, I'm very honored to be here with Miki because I talk about Grace King and use Grace King as a source in the book. And Miki has written about Grace King and has studied Grace King and has gone through archival letters of Grace King and has a book, New Orleans Author and Mark Twain's Court, which I bought and I highly recommend. Everyone does. But when I started going through the sporting periodicals, these are not on a database. You can't just go to newspapers.com or Ancestry, whatever it is, and type in Lexington racehorse, because it's not going to come up. I mean, it will come up, but not how you need it. And so I went to the Kenyon Library, and they don't have it, on a computer database form. You get the periodicals, which are gigantic, huge periodicals, and you turn these rag pages one by one, looking for the information you need. And I loved it, because it was in that process that I really learned about the people of the 19th century. And I mean, they were so funny. They had such a great sense of humor. So I learned about, how they thought and the kind of things that made them laugh, and their fashions, their theater, their food, how much things cost. Of course, the sporting scene, which was horse racing back then, some billiards, some prize fighting, the Yankee Sullivan. And it was, to me, I mean, I really enjoyed the research part of this whole process. And so then from Kenyon, it then branches out to the historical societies. In Kentucky, I went to West Point to find out why Richard Tenbrook left West Point. To Virginia, to Middleburg, the National Sporting Museum, where I studied the pedigree of Lexington, which is questionable, by the way. Also into where am I not remembering? I mean, I seem like I went to so many places, in addition to requesting information from archival sources, such as the National Archives. There's a section in the book that talks about the Civil War in Kentucky and the raids that were occurring on the horse farms there, particularly Woodburn Farm, which was the farm in Midway, Kentucky, where Lexington stood at stud. And so there were these Confederate guerrilla raids that were, I mean, they were just really wreaking havoc all throughout Kentucky. And the guerrilla gang that primarily was responsible for these raids on Woodburn Farm was ultimately court-martialed, in front of the Union. And it was those court-martial records that I requested from the National Archives. I mean, these are handwritten court proceedings. That's where I got a lot of the information about the guerrilla gang. And to me, to really bring the story to life is to make it vivid, and to give detail in order to make that happen. And so I tried very, very hard to get as much detail as I could. And of course, when you're talking about the 19th century, there's gaps, there's gaps, and you're not going to get everything. But if you can just look for those sources, I mean, you can find information in the most surprising places. And when you do, we talked about this last night, it's a treasure, when you find something unexpected. And I just love research. I would research forever. I would still be researching, I think, because I guarantee you there's still stuff out there that I haven't found.
Yeah, it's hard to leave your
It is hard.
Your project.
Yeah.
Right. Well, why don't you talk about the Louisiana connection
Yes.
that Lexington had, because we want to
That's
know
why
about that.
we're here. Lexington, so Lexington was bred in Lexington, Kentucky, under the name of Darley. And he eventually falls into the hands of Richard Tenbrook, who is this guy from Albany, New York, who has come into Louisiana and into New Orleans and has bought over what was the Metairie Racecourse, which is now the Metairie Cemetery, right? But then it was a racecourse. And he became the owner and the promoter, and he was a wizard. I mean, he was genius at how he orchestrated these events, drawing people from all over the nation then into the Metairie, of course, through the ticket charging gates of the Metairie, so he could make all of this money. But he was really ingenious in coming up with promotional ideas to bring people into the Metairie. And so he came up with this race called the Great State Post Stakes, and it was supposed to be a race that matched the best horse from as many states as he could get, and he got 4 states. And he went looking for a horse to represent the state of Kentucky, and that's how he ended up with Darley. Of course, being the promotional wizard that he was, the horse cannot race for the state of Kentucky under the name of Darley, so he changed the name to Lexington. And so he brings Lexington to New Orleans, and it was in what year? In 1854. Actually, 1853, he goes to Natchez. Tim Brooke sends him to Natchez to train, and then he starts his racing career with Tim Brooke at the Metairie in 1854. And so it was at the Metairie and in New Orleans where Lexington ran the remainder of his races, and broke a world record in the process, at the Metairie Racecourse. And I loved New Orleans. I fell in love with New Orleans when I was researching that part of the story, and of course visited and did some research in New Orleans. And I didn't want to leave that part of the story because I liked so much living in that world, 19th century New Orleans.
And one of his races was against time.
Yes, against time.
Yeah. Rather than other horses.
Yes.
Why don't you talk about that?
So the race against time, which was the first occasion that had ever happened in the United States, where a horse was matched not against other contenders, but against the constant time. And so there was a horse that Lexington had raced and lost to by the name of Lecomte. Am I saying this? Lecomte?
Yes.
Lecomte.
Lecomte.
And Lecomte had broken an American speed record by setting a 4-mile race. Horses ran not just furlongs, they ran these heat races back then, which were 4 miles. That was the upper echelon of racing. So the horse could run 4 miles, take a 45-minute break, go out and run another 4 miles. And this occurred in these heats until at least one horse won 2 heats. And so it could go on for 12 miles, 20 miles, but 8 at a minimum, right? And so the horse Lecomte had broken an American speed record for running 4 miles in the same race that he defeated Lexington. And so Richard Tim Brooke tries to rematch the two horses, but the owner of Lecomte says, no, we've set our record. We're not going to visit you and go down that track again. And so Richard Tim Brooke does the next thing that he can think of, which is to challenge Lexington against time, or against the time of 7 minutes and 26 seconds. Had never happened in the history of American horse racing. And so if you think about it, right, here's a horse who was going blind. Lexington was going blind at this point, was running with the right eye completely blind, the left one impacted, had suffered just come off of a loss to Lecomte. And Richard Tim Brooke challenges this horse to defeat Lecomte's record against the immortal constant time. A time, a competitor that cannot lose under any circumstances whatsoever. Whereas the horse, a mortal being, can lose for any given thing, right? And so the pundits were just all against Lexington. They said, there's no way this mortal horse can beat immortal time. And he goes into that race.
And you'll have to read the book for the rest of the story.
And everything was against him. Everything was against him in that race.
So would it have been easier if the two horses had been in the same race?
Yeah, he tried to get that set up, and General Wells, the owner of Lecomte, refused to rematch.
So nobody talked about, hey, he had an advantage of hunting by himself.
Well, what they did was they trained Lexington. J.B. Pryor, the trainer of Lexington for Richard Tim Brooke, they trained the horse against the chronometer. They trained him to run, and they spent many months training him and conditioning him to run with those numbers in mind that they needed to beat time. And he was trained at the Versailles, am I saying correctly?
Which?
Versailles Racecourse in Natchez.
Oh, I don't know.
Okay,
I don't know.
he was trained at the Versailles. I'm from Texas, so I may not pronounce these names correctly. I apologize. The Versailles Racecourse in Natchez, and so he was trained against other fast horses. And every time he would enter a new mile, J.B. Pryor would release a fresh, fast horse and challenge that fresh horse against Lexington. And every single time, Lexington outpaced the other horse, carrying large amounts of weights, you know. And I mean, so he really strengthened that horse to do what he had to do to break time.
I learned more about horses and terminology than I ever knew that I wanted to know. But it's absolutely fascinating. Did you know about how differently horses were trained and just the transportation of horses from one place to the other? In the 19th century and now, did you know anything about that?
No, I researched all of that. And so I went to find out how horses were trained. I went to the American Turf Registers, and they had material in there from the 1830s, 1832, 1833, that talked about the conditioning and training of horses to run the heat systems. And I have that in the book because to me that was fascinating in how they did that, how much the horses were fed, 12 quarts of grain, you know, how much they were fed to do this, you know, and it was, you know, they were exercised under very heavy flannel blankets in order to, the idea of being promote circulation, to sweat them and promote circulation. And I mean, it was very bizarre and very different how they did this. Also how they brought horses back, how they recovered horses during the 45-minute process in between heats, and how they recovered horses after the races. And the transportation, that was, I mean, I wanted to know.
Absolutely fascinating.
Well, that's not even half of it, because the editor cut a lot of that out to make the book speed up and go along. So there's a lot that I wanted to have in there that I guess you can thank my editor is not in there, you know, to speed up the process. But I wanted to know how things were done. You know, how did horses get, you know, we don't have airplanes that we can fly them from race course to race course like we do now, or, you know, brookledge horse transportation. And, you know, and so it was interesting to me how that occurred. And so I looked into that, and I remember, you know, spending months just on studying horse transportation, you know, and transportation in general, you know, across the Mississippi River and the railroads and, you know, the steamships that were out on the Atlantic, and you know, how that process occurred. And quite frankly, I was terrified. After reading how any transportation occurred back then, I was just really admiring these people for being so brave.
Yes, and the horse had to stand up in a small stall,
yes,
like for 8 days on a Mississippi
that's right.
steamboat. It's astounding. Just that is astounding. So you know, we non-horse people hear thoroughbred and we think racing, but that was only part of Lexington's fame, wasn't it?
Correct.
His contribution, his legacy is different.
His legacy is different. I mean, as a phenomenal racehorse as he was, because he was, after that he enters the stud career part, right, in Midway, Kentucky, and that was a pioneering endeavor as well. I mean, we look at Richard Tim Brooke as a pioneering man because of everything he did. He really built the Metairie course in New Orleans and made New Orleans in many ways the mecca of horse racing in the 19th century. And so in that pioneering spirit, there was also another individual who then buys Lexington from Richard Tim Brooke, and his name was Robert Alexander, and he was a British subject, and his family had owned land in Midway, Kentucky, but he was supposed to be in England, where he was supposed to inherit an ironworks foundry and run that business over there, but his heart was in Kentucky, so he returns to Kentucky, takes over the Woodburn farm in Midway, and endeavors to make it into a thoroughbred breeding facility and an auction house, basically, for thoroughbreds. That had never occurred in America. Of course, it was going on in England, you know, what we think of Tattersall's and so forth, the thoroughbred auction houses, you know, that was occurring in England, but not in America. So Keeneland and Fasig-Tipton that we have today is all based off of what Robert Alexander started in Kentucky with Woodburn Farm and Lexington. And so Robert Alexander buys Lexington, makes him the primary stud at Woodburn Farm, and he then becomes, such a successful sire that he is now considered the foundation American thoroughbred. I challenge anyone to look at any racehorse that crosses the finish today and go back in that pedigree, and you're going to find Lexington in there, crossed somewhere. When I was researching, because I was trying to come up with an idea of how to relay this into terms that we in our modern day can understand, and so I looked at famous horses, so the Triple Crown winners, and all but one have crosses of Lexington in the pedigree. It's just phenomenal. You look at all of the horses who have been Horse of the Year, in the last 20 years or so, and they all have Lexington in the pedigree. The first 20 runners of the Kentucky Derby all traced directly pell-mell to Lexington within 1 to 2 generations. The first 20 winners of the Belmont Stakes, the first 20 winners of the Maryland Cup, the first 20 winners of the Saratoga Travers Stakes, and it's all direct trace, which is, right there, not just in the pedigree somewhere, but a direct pell-mell trace within 1 to 2 generations. It was just really phenomenal, the progeny that this horse developed. And so he is the only horse in history that carries the title of greatest American sire 16 times. No horses match that. But it almost didn't happen.
Yes. And those turbulent times in the Civil War, I had, you read about, and they took horses, but you don't get the sense of how valuable, how necessary, how mistreated, how used up horses were during the Civil War. Her part 2 is about that, and it's astounding. I'll never read about the Civil War and ignore horses anymore because it was just amazing. Excuse me, I just lost my thought there. What did you learn about yourself writing this book?
My gosh, perseverance, which I think is what this whole story is about. The horse persevered through so much, through blindness and of course, running 4-mile heats. The individuals that were connected to the horse, Richard Tinbrook and Robert Alexander, both had to persevere through tragedies and, of course, the Civil War for Alexander. And perseverance, to get this book done, it took a lot of perseverance. And so to me, I learned about myself to persevere, just like my subjects, right?
Good.
So it was inspiring to me, as I was doing it.
Right. And, these guys...
And I learned that I love research.
Yes. It's so fascinating. So what's next for you now?
What's next is I'm looking in history. I love history. So I'm looking into some other areas. I have about 2 or 3 subjects that I'm looking into, and every
Staying
time I
with
come
horse
up,
racing?
No. Something
I told her
different.
she could call races because she describes these races, and they make the turn, and I'm seeing the dust, and I'm hearing the noise, and it's just, the writing is really special. Would you like to read a paragraph or 2 somewhere in the book, and then we'll open the floor to questions, because I have a feeling there are questions here.
Let me find something.
She had me at hello in this book. And while she looks, this is, if you look at the Metairie Cemetery, you can see the racetrack yet in the cemetery. You can come up and see this later.
All right.
And you can get very lost trying to find the graves in that racetrack path.
Yeah, that's a pass. I've been to that cemetery, walking the track. The Metairie Avenue is where Lexington ran. All right, so this is the Great State Post Stakes. Lexington's, the reason he was bought and renamed Lexington. This is that race. By April 1st, the day of the great state, some 20,000 people, all with the goal of witnessing what the Picayune labeled the most celebrated event in the annals of turf history, had taken up temporary residence in the city. All of them purchased their grandstand tickets, which on this day were double the normal price. Those in the members section basked on the knowledge that they would dine on eggs and thinly sliced meat, and indulge in bottomless glasses of champagne. People filled the parlors and halls of every hotel and establishment with laughter and talk. Of the Kentucky women at the St. Charles, Ripley wrote how they talked in that soft Southern accent so peculiarly their own, how they laughed, how they moved about, seemingly knowing everybody they met, how they bet. Despite the previous days of rain and wind, the day of the great state was beautiful and warm. The mayor of New Orleans declared it a half holiday. That morning, all the avenues leading out of the city were clogged with every means of transportation imaginable. Wooden carts and drays loaded with people and hauled by mules wheeled slowly alongside grand carriages of polished mahogany with red velvet seats and gold-colored spokes. Gloved passengers opened picnic baskets filled with Southern-style arrays of baked ham, chicken, brandy, beer, and, of course, cigars. Sporty, bright yellow curricles, two-seaters, zipped through between larger carriages, leaving trails of dust and squeezing out riders on horseback. A 9-passenger stagecoach owned by the St. Charles rode through, carrying far more than the allotted number, spiking the air with a party-fevered pitch. The whole of the morning was an exodus of sorts, a divestment from the city of nearly a fifth of its population, all of whom were trying to make it out to the Metairie, the promised land. There was one problem. The same rain and windstorm that had ripped the chimneys off the New Orleans packet steamer had turned the Metairie's track into a mud pit. Worse, as the wind swept across the track, the dirt had stiffened into a clingy, glue-like consistency. Mud, 8 inches in depth, congealed across the top. The Picayune called it tenacious, as if the mud had a mind of its own. And though Lexington was a mudder, bettors doubted he could prevail in his first attempt at 4-mile heats. In the spirit, one man predicted, "I do not think Lexington has enough foot for these flyers." His questionable speed wasn't the only issue the gambling crowd considered before parting with their hard-earned cash. Thanks to the Picayune's write-up about the Sally Waters match, the reading public was now aware that Tim Brooks' horse had questionable vision. Those who had visited the horse tucked away in his stall at the Metairie had seen the opaqueness, the untracking gaze hauntingly absent of life, as if a part of his soul had vanished. The only glimmer of Lexington's spirit may have been the abrupt turn of his head toward a noise, his incessant pawing at the ground, or his nose nudging their shoulders as if to say, "What do you see?" Whatever physical power the stallion might have, his felling vision could upend any chance of his winning. But a stellar victory over the highly acclaimed Sally Waters, when he had run nearly blind, gave bettors some assurance. Many of them took the risk. In the odds, Lexington trailed second to Alabama's Highlander.
Good. Thank you. That gives you a feeling. Now, open to the floor. Have your questions. Whoop, this lady here.
Your comments on horse by Geraldine Brooks.
Yes, so
LeCount.
we were talking about that a little earlier. And so if anyone has not read Horse by Geraldine Brooks, I really recommend that you do. That is the historical version of Lexington. This is the nonfiction version of Lexington. Horse is the historical version of Lexington, and she did, I think, a really great job with that book. Oddly, when I got to meet her when she came to Lexington to promote Horse, and so our editors, because we're under the same publishing house, our editors arranged for us to sit down and have lunch, and she was very gracious and very kind, and we did that, and we talked about our research, which she had started, I think what she told me was in 2010. She had started researching Lexington. I started in 2012. But we had never encountered each other at all during any of this process. And we were talking about the fact that both of us, I mean, we went to the same places. Both of us went to West Point, and we were talking about that. And how odd, that we would go to West Point and research Richard Tenbrook, and of course there was not the information there that we were hoping to find, the smoking gun, if you will, as to why he left, for sure. But it was not until my agent was sending the book out to publishers, and she sent it to Viking, which is the publisher of Horse, that we learned about horse.
That's so devastating.
And
when
I
you're
was devastated. I thought
researching.
that was it for me right then and there. When she told me, she said, "Well, Viking said that Geraldine Brooks is writing about
that's-
Lexington, but that it's a historical fiction." I really did think it was over for me right then and
Yeah,
there. I thought,
yeah.
it's
It's
over.
just devastating.
It's over, you know.
But she was very gracious,
Yeah.
giving a blurb to Lexington.
She
She
was.
says that it was researched with breathtaking thoroughness, written with imagination and verve, and that Kim Wickens has unearthed a vivid portrait of America's greatest stallion, and she gives a fascinating account from start to finish. So that was a gracious thing for her to do.
It was.
And the books are complementary. If you've read Horse, you want to read Lexington. If you read Lexington, yes, you want to know more about this horse, and it's there. You can see the interweaving of the two books, but they're complementary rather than competing. And you had a question.
I just wanted to note that Kentucky was a border state
Yes.
in the Civil War.
Yes.
And really was owned, the eastern part, the Yankees pretty much owned it.
Yes.
And then the western part is when it resisted. So these robbers, or whatever you call them, they had to come from the west into the east to do that, and that's probably why they caught that guy.
Yes, and I mean, Kentucky was so torn, because it was, and that's in here, it was a border state, and it was so divided, and people, I mean, it was astounding to me when I was reading about the Civil War in Kentucky. I mean, people would flip sides, just at random, they would get angry about this thing, and then all of a sudden, now they're for this side, and I mean, it was really just jagged and torn. It really was, and because of that, it became fodder. The whole state became fodder for all of this off the grid, Rough Rider, guerrilla activity, and the Union Guard that was stationed there were not really effective. And so that was one of the reasons that George Prentice, the editor of the Louisville Daily Journal, decided to make such an issue of this guy that he named Sue Mundy in order to get the attention of President Lincoln so that Lincoln would change out the Union Guard in Kentucky, which he did. Yeah.
Right. And they were wearing Union uniforms sometime, or a coat or something. So who knew what side they were on, these guerrillas? I mean, that was a fascinating story in itself, and how the breeder had to try to hide these precious thoroughbreds that he had developed so carefully.
Yes.
So that's a fascinating part. Yes, sir.
Did you personally get involved with horses, and what kind of horses are you using in your dressage?
So I have had horses kind of in my life, since I was a little kid. Of course, when I went to law school and then practiced as a lawyer, I stepped away from horses because that was all time consuming for me. But I got back into horses later in my life, and then started to pursue dressage. So I have 3 horses, and 2 of them are warm bloods. The third one is a very precious leopard Appaloosa named Flash. He is so cute. He looks like a Dalmatian. He's very, very colorful and very friendly, the sweetest guy ever. Unlike the mare, who has to let everybody know she's a mare. And then the other one is a 5-year-old, and he's a goofball.
Well, you realize with this story, too, the personalities of these horses. I was so moved as Lexington was dying. But you had a question.
Actually, I wanted to know, how long did he live? Do we know? And you spoke of his unifying power in your opening comments.
Yeah. Yes. So Lexington lived for 25 years, and he died in 1875. If I'm remembering this, I should know because, my gosh. And it was at that time when he did die that his bones were ultimately exhumed because he had made such an impact in his lifetime, on society. And, there's a great quote that I put in the very beginning, that he was not just a turfman's horse, he was the nation's horse. And because of that celebrity status, and people adored. They wrote that he was almost, I mean, this is sacrilegious to say, but that he almost had like a deity, aspect about him, that he was so revered. And he was exhumed. The bones were exhumed about 4 months after he died and was buried, and then they were articulated for the Smithsonian Institute. And so
that part is really true.
that is, well, he is owned by the Smithsonian Institute, and he was put together for the Smithsonian Institute at their request. And he now stands, I mean, anyone can go to Lexington, Kentucky, to the Kentucky Horse Park and see him. He's on display there. I go all the time.
And I think that might have been part of the way he came back into the consciousness of the nation, this idea about moving the bones
Yes.
to Kentucky. And there's something about Blue Horse.
Yes,
If you go
there's-
to Kentucky, the tours have a blue horse, and it's a symbol of Lexington,
Yes,
right?
it's Lexington's image that's on the front of the book, but they colored it blue. UK, UK Wildcats, right? And so they colored it blue. But this blue horse is all throughout Lexington, Kentucky, and it's Lexington. And so he's really their mascot, but blue, but blue. But he was. So, at the time that the nation was already torn apart, and you already had, you had like the early races were called North versus South races because it was already, back in the 1830s, 40s, the North versus the South. And so already, there was all this tension, right, between the divisions. You had the Missouri Compromise of 1820, you had the fugitive slave law, all of this, right, was going on, at the time right there before Lexington. He was foaled in 1850, ran in 1853, 1854, and 1855. And so it was this horse who, I think probably because, he had so much courage and drive and courage to run half blind and so forth. I think, he was just, he served really as a unifying horse, even if for just those brief years, right? Where you didn't just have North versus South, but you had the whole nation behind him.
And then, as in horse, his bones get disappeared they get filed away at the Smithsonian, and then they're brought out again by Lexington, Kentucky. So, she fills in the spaces about the bones. Yes.
Realize that book was being written at the same time.
Well,
So
it was all, after the fact. And I did not read Horse, just so you know. I did not read Horse until this was in copy edits because I did not want to be influenced or intimidated by Geraldine Brooks, And so I wanted that division there.
I personally think that either will complement the other.
Oh, absolutely. You want to know both books. You want the pleasure of each of them in their own way. Any other questions? We have a few more minutes, 5 minutes.
I have one.
Yes.
Kim, the horse training that you do, could you explain that a little bit? I understand you're supposed to give subtle tips to the horse as you're running it through its pace.
Yeah, so in dressage, and mind you, I am not a professional. I am not, I will say that. I am not a professional horse rider. But in dressage, it's really a beautiful dance that the rider is doing with the horse. And it's a series of movements, that the horse and rider are supposed to make that are supposed to be just imperceptible. You can't see, this manhandling of the horse, so to speak, with the reins and so forth. And so it's really working with the horse, and it takes a long time, long time to develop that relationship with your dance partner, right? And to be able to carry off, these beautiful movements. You have a human's brain and you have a horse's brain, and trying to combine those with feel, right? With feel, and to be able to do it as subtly as possible so that you're moving as one in these pirouettes. I don't do pirouettes, that's way advanced for me, but just side passes and just beautiful. If you can ever Google it or watch it at the Olympics. It's the people that are riding at that level. It's just amazing to watch. It's just beautifully done.
Well, speaking of that, one of the questions I had was about the jockeys. Do you want
Yes.
to say a few words
Yes,
about
okay.
the jockeys?
And I'm glad you brought that up.
And how differently they rode the horses.
Yes. So a lot, and this is in the book, a lot of the training, of course, we're talking pre-Civil War, right? And so a lot of the training then was done by the enslaved. And they were the jockeys. I mean, we had white jockeys and white trainers as well, right? But we had a lot of them, and I would say the majority were the enslaved or freed men, freed black men that had the experience of working with these animals and taking care of them, on the plantations and so forth. And they carried that skill over, into the racing world. And so it was those men whose skill and know-how, basically, were put, to these horses and enabled them, to succeed. But it was a very interesting world for these men because on one hand, they could be viewed as celebrities, and they were paid very well. So in 1832, when my brain just can't think, when one of the individuals who was an enslaved man rode at one of the North
Abe
versus,
Hawkins?
not Abe Hawkins, but
okay.
another one,
Okay.
Charles Stewart, when he rode in New York in one of the North versus South races in 1832, was paid $300 to ride that race. Think about that, an enslaved man, and so they could earn great sums. They could travel at will without having to be questioned, and so forth, but yet they're still enslaved, right? They're still enslaved, and they could be sold at any time out of that life where they had tasted this kind of unusual life that men of their rank did not have, right? Because of their enslaved status. And so it's tragic, really, in many ways. It's like I remember that story, Flowers for Algernon, that I read when I was a kid. And it was about, a man who, had because of a scientific method, had, reached a stage where he was no longer mentally impaired, but he could see what it was like to have a normal life, and then he regressed back into that, but with the knowledge of what it could have been. And it was kind of like that for these men, to have that awareness of what life could be like, and then to have that ripped away from them at any moment, for any reason, And so Abe Hawkins was a black enslaved man who rode Lecomte in all of these races against Lexington,
Very
including
much.
the race where he defeats Lexington.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Very much in demand. One last question. Make it a final one.
You said the book Horse was a fiction.
Well,
It's a
it's
historical
very well researched,
Yes.
but the characters, some of the characters, some are not. Like Richard Tenbrook is in there, but some. The character who finds the painting and the character who's at the Smithsonian, those are fictional characters, as far as I know.
Yes.
Yeah. But, a good fiction, if it's well done, should be based in good research, too. But read both of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Read both.
And thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for